Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. One of the best things about being a YouTuber is you get this kind of instant feedback from the audiences in the comments section, and I love troweling through the comments section whenever I have time. I look for interesting comments, interesting questions, and of course those really engaging and funny insults. Those are the best. So recently I came upon this question from our viewer Jesse. He asks, with how the Jedi were about making sure dark side tendencies weren't practiced, how come Dathomir and the Nightsisters were allowed to continue their practices? So this is a really good question by Jesse because, as we all know, the Jedi Order, despite being this noble and heroic organization, they've always had a really dark past in how they dealt with the dark side and any dark side force user. Now, whether it's Mace Windu trying to execute the legally elected leader of the Republic because he just happened to be a Sith Lord, or that time those Jedi Masters from the Taurus Tower murdered their Padawan because they happened to have a shared vision which vaguely seemed to indicate that one of their Padawans would fall to the dark side and end up causing all of their deaths and the destruction of the Jedi Order and the Republic. Let's also not forget the aftermath of the Great Hyperspace War, where the Jedi-led Republic forces managed to repel the Sith invasion from Coruscant, and then they chased those Darksiders all the way back to Korriban and essentially killed and purged all of the Sith they could find. Republic historians would call this campaign the post-Great Hyperspace War counter-invasion, but the Sith simply called it a Holocaust, which is exactly what it was. So the Jedi were terrific for normies. If you really needed their help, they would help. This was legitimate. But if you are a dark side force user, the Jedi will justify any type of extreme action, whether it's extrajudicial killings, throwing coups, killing their Padawan, or even genociding an entire species. That was okay, as long as they were Darksiders. This was the true nature of the Jedi. Their fear of the dark side blinded them from how extreme they actually were. I mean, this is a really severe problem within the Jedi Order, and their teachings didn't really help explain what the dark side was to future generations. They just passed down this kind of fear and complete rejection of anything dark side related, which of course is not healthy. If there's something that you're afraid of, you should try to learn about it, understand how it works, right? Jedi were not in this category of thinking. Instead, the very idea of the dark side was banned. Sith artifacts, cryptocurrencies, holocrons were locked away for only the most trusted and oldest Jedi Masters to look at in the archives, and still they needed approval from the Council. And so there was basically no training for the younger Jedis on how to deal with the dark side, how to recognize it in others and also in themselves, because the truth was every person had the dark side inside of themselves. Even Yoda, when he went and visited Dagobah for the first time and he entered this cave, he encountered a dark side version of himself. And so instead of having a healthy understanding of the dark side inside of all of us and talking with each other about the struggles they're going through in their daily lives, the Jedi just viewed any dark side behavior as something impure and not something you would want to expose to others. And so if you had dark side tendencies like Count Dooku or Anakin, you sort of just hid it from the Jedi, which of course is not a good idea. If this all sounds over the top, controlling, and paranoid, you are absolutely correct. But there's a reason why the Jedi are like this. You see, the first dark side force users, they were actually exiled Jedi. These are oftentimes individuals who were in the Jedi Order who just had certain personality types that were curious about learning about things. And if you ban certain things, there are certain type of individuals, myself included, that are just gonna be like, why did you ban it? I want to take a look at it. And boom, these guys immediately find out what the dark side is about, the massive power you can kind of gain from using the dark side, especially when you're, fighting people and using combat techniques. And suddenly these guys were just banned and exiled and kicked out of the Jedi Order. The thing was, the Jedi banished these people into very unpopulated areas where they could start anew and start their own society. And it was in this vacuum of balance and guidance that these first dark side exiles began to build their own competing empires in the Outer Rim. And since then, a good percentage of Sith leaders were fallen Jedi who embraced the dark side and caused a great deal of trouble for the galaxy. This was a completely 100% Jedi created problem. Now, interestingly enough, because we are talking about the Nightsisters, the Nightsisters of Dathomir were originally all trained by one exiled Jedi named Alia. She was kicked off Coruscant and then basically taken to Dathomir. One-way trip. Now, there are no records of Alia within the Jedi archives, but the Nightsisters claim that Alia was a Jedi, and she actually wrote their Book of Laws, which is kind of like, the book that dictates what they should or shouldn't do in their daily lives. And this book was really, really critical of the Jedi Order, obviously because they kicked her out. And this is kind of what shapes the Nightsisters' mistrust of the Jedi organization, but they're not antagonistic in the way the Sith work. They don't really want to go out and pursue the Republic or the Jedi and destroy them. They just don't like them. And so the Nightsisters seem like a lot of the other native populations that were influenced by exiled Jedi. They all turned into Darksiders, kind of like what happened on the Sith homeworld of Korriban. But there actually are a few key differences between these two groups. You see, the fallen Jedi of Korriban would breed with the local red-blooded Sith. They would organize Sith society and create a mighty military power that rivaled the Republic. The Sith Empire represented a clear and present danger to the Republic. Remember, they got all the way to Coruscant and almost took over the city if it weren't for the Jedi. This is why the Republic and the Jedi carried out this counter-invasion and genocided the crap out of the Sith. I mean, Korriban became a ghost planet basically afterwards. For the Republic, having a very powerful Force faction like the Sith not controlled by the Jedi monopoly was a very terrifying idea. Now, the thing on Dathomir with the Nightsisters is they never kind of developed this hostile stance. The way the Force evolves on this planet was very different and very unique, I'd say. For one, the Nightsisters would never explode in population. They would never really develop into an advanced society or civilization that controlled multiple planets and systems. As a matter of fact, they just stayed in local clans and tribes as far as that's how their society was organized. It was relatively primitive. And this is also because the Nightsisters had a very special connection to the Force that was very different from both the Sith and the Jedi. So all beings in the galaxy technically have some connection to the Force because of the midichlorians in their bloodstream. If you have enough midichlorians, you can actually begin to manipulate the living Force. And this is what separates a normal person from a Jedi or Sith. The Nightsisters' Force abilities were directly connected to the planet of Dathomir and the magical ichor that flowed everywhere on the planet. This green mist was the source of the Nightsisters' power and was seen as a magical substance. This magical ichor is derived from the Force, but it's actually a little different from how the Force worked on other planets or for other species. For instance, the Dathomiri Nightsisters could not have access to this magical ichor off of the planet. This meant that for most Nightsisters, their powers only worked on the planet. Once they left Dathomir, they just reverted to their natural Force power, which could be, basically nothing. This is why most Nightsisters rarely ever left home, and they're actually a really rare sight in the wider galaxy. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Jedi Order forgot they even existed, which is just like one of the simpler explanations why the Jedi didn't bother them. There's also the fact that when a Nightsister used the magical ichor, it didn't seem to corrupt their bodies. This is generally what happened to dark side Force users, which is why most Sith Lords have a very gruesome looking appearance. Nightsisters were able to wield the powers of the dark side through the magical ichor and not have it affect them physically and also mentally. That mental aspect is really important because as a result, the Nightsisters would never become power hungry or overly ambitious because of their dark side Force usage. You guys know the classic story about the Sith Lord who just becomes too power hungry and they end up destroying themselves. This is just classic Sith behavior, and this is something that we do not see with the Dathomiri Nightsisters. As a matter of fact, the Dathomiri Nightsisters didn't even believe in the light or dark side of the Force. They drew no distinction about what Force powers they used. They saw everything as just one large energy field. The sole thing that really drove the Nightsisters was the survival of their clan. This was extremely important and overruled everything else. And so the most important thing for the Nightsisters was actually the survival of the clan. And so they viewed everything from the Night Brothers to the magical ichor to the Force as tools to help them preserve their society and way of life. And so the Nightsisters viewing the Force, while not completely compatible with the Jedi, was also not very antagonistic towards the Jedi. They kind of just existed in their own school of thought over here, whereas the Jedi and the Sith were just, butting heads and clashing constantly. If anything, if you take a closer look at how the Nightsisters operated, their views of the Force and, actually their cultural practices remind me a lot of the ancient Jedi or the Grey Jedi, who are both what I would consider neutral factions that use both the light and dark side of the Force. And because the Nightsisters have been isolated on the planet of Dathomir for such a long time, they managed to collect knowledge that was long lost by both the Jedi and Sith, who were just constantly killing each other and destroying each other's culture and knowledge. For instance, the Nightsisters didn't just bend the Force to their will. They also knew a long list of different spells and incantations. They knew how to practice Force alchemy, which was a long-lost art that both the Sith and the Jedi forgot. And they could also use their abilities to manipulate the magical ichor, which was used in a lot of the spells. Now, Mother Talzin, who was one of the last great matriarchs of the Nightsisters, could do all sorts of crazy things with the Force. On one occasion, when Asajj Ventress and 2 assassins were assigned to take out Count Dooku, she gave them an invisibility spell that worked even off the planet. When Maul was found by his brother Savage Opress, Mother Talzin made him brand new legs, which also still existed when he left the planet. This is actually like a really ancient technique that only the Jedi really understood back in the day, how to create, flesh from the Force itself. It's a really crazy and powerful skill to have. The Nightsisters were also known for magical ritual burials that turned their deceased into undead ghouls that could be called upon by the sisters to defend the planet from invaders. The reality is all of these little abilities, this witchcraft, would be seen as something very negative by the Jedi Orthodoxy, which really didn't like this type of manipulation of the Force. They wanted to go one with the Force, and they saw such things as unnatural. But the Jedi would remain completely focused on the Sith because of their past history and the many wars that they had fought against the Sith. And while the Nightsisters would have been viewed as like a troubling organization by the Jedi Order, the truth is there were a lot of dark side factions, really small ones like the Nightsisters, that existed all across the galaxy. And the Jedi just simply did not have the energy or manpower or the political will to really destroy all these factions. And so I think the Nightsisters were kind of saved by this fact that the Jedi didn't have resources to deal with them, and also because they more or less were isolated and kept to themselves. If you really think about it, the Sith weren't just dark side Force users. They were actually politically and historically motivated to go after the Jedi because of all their past grievances. There was some bad blood there that transcended just Force usage. Once the Jedi realized that the Nightsisters' focus was always on internal issues on their planets and keeping their clan strong and safe, they were just moved lower on the priority list. And this kind of speaks to the more practical side of the Jedi Order, which is surprising because, as we've said, this is a very religious almost kind of organization that has this orthodoxy that just will not bend. But there has to be some practicality when you're running a galactic-wide organization, especially one that deals with security threats. I mean, the Jedi have always had this practical side if you think about it, and that's because they deal with the Republic. I mean, they are guardians of the Republic, and so they have to guard, some corrupt Republic politicians and corporate leaders. This has always been the trade-off. If they can make exceptions for these type of people, surely the Nightsisters are not going to be in an existential crisis for the Jedi. If anything, Jedi archivists, individuals like Jocasta Nu, could learn a great deal from these strange witches who live on a very Force-rich world. The Jedi always viewed the Force as more of a mysterious and holy kind of energy force, and using the scientific method against the Force or the midichlorians was usually frowned upon, but still, that magical ichor was really crazy. I'm sure they would like to get their hands on it and figure out how it works. Unfortunately, though, the Nightsister leader Mother Talzin would make a terrible mistake by making arrangements with the Sith. This would bring the Clone Wars to Dathomir and eventually lead to the destruction of the Nightsisters. A lot of people might see the Nightsisters as an evil faction because of how they look and, because of their magic and witchcraft, but if you really think about it, the Nightsisters are a better representation of the cruelty of nature. I mean, these are people who are very, very close to their planet. They have a symbiotic relationship with this magical ichor that flows everywhere. And in a lot of ways, it's because of this magical ichor that Dathomir has never developed into a normal planet, because instead of developing technology, medicine, you just have magic, right? This is why they're such a primitive society. I mean, if you take a look at how the Nightsisters behaved with the Night Brothers, for instance, they're all about the survival of the strongest. They were very much about natural selection. But eventually the galaxy would modernize, and the Nightsisters and their primitive ways would just fall behind everyone. When Count Dooku arrived on Dathomir with legions of separatist droids, the witches of Dathomir didn't even stand a chance and were quickly wiped out. And so that's at the core of this question. Why didn't the Jedi crack down on the Dathomiri Witches? And that's because the Nightsisters were not a strong political, economic, or military faction. They really didn't threaten anyone outside of their own planet. Well, thank you for that question, Jesse. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.